David Reynolds tightened his grip on the grocery bags as he walked toward his car, his 6-year-old daughter, Emily, skipping beside him. The weight of the bags wasn't the real problem, it was the weight of everything else. The overdue rent, the electric bill hanging over his head, and the stack of applications he had sent out with no response. Every day felt like a battle just to keep things together. As he reached his old, dented sedan, Emily tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy, that lady dropped her oranges." David looked up and spotted an elderly woman struggling with her own bags near the curb. A few bright oranges had rolled away from her, and she was bending down, wincing as she tried to pick them up. Without hesitation, David put his own bags down. "Stay here, Em," he said gently before jogging over. The woman looked up as he approached, her face lined with age but kind. "Oh, dear, I'm afraid my hands aren't as steady as they used to be," she said with a small chuckle. David crouched down, gathering the oranges and placing them back in her bag. "Let me help you with these," he offered, glancing at her cart. It wasn't just the oranges, her entire load seemed too heavy for her small frame. She hesitated for a moment before nodding with a grateful smile. "That would be wonderful, young man. My car is just over there." She pointed to an older model luxury sedan parked a few spots away. David carried her bags across the lot, and Emily followed, holding onto the hem of his jacket. Once they reached the car, the woman unlocked the trunk, and David placed the bags inside carefully. "You're very kind," she said, watching him. "Not everyone stops to help these days." David shrugged. "It's nothing, really." She studied him for a moment, her sharp blue eyes taking him in. "What's your name, dear?" "David Reynolds," he said, extending his hand. She shook it firmly. "I'm Eleanor Whitmore. A pleasure to meet you, David." Emily peeked out from behind him. "I'm Emily," she announced proudly. Eleanor's face lit up. "Well, hello, Emily. You have a wonderful daddy." Emily nodded. "He's the best." David chuckled, ruffling her hair. "She's biased." Eleanor smiled warmly. "I used to have a little girl just like you," she said, her voice carrying a hint of nostalgia. "She grew up too fast." David could see the emotion in her eyes, but before he could say anything, she reached into her purse and pulled out a crisp $20 bill. "For your kindness." He shook his head immediately. "Oh no, ma'am, I can't accept that, I just—" She held up a hand. "Nonsense. Consider it a little thank you. Buy your daughter something sweet." David hesitated, but Emily's hopeful eyes made him cave. He took the bill with a grateful nod. "Thank you, Ms. Whitmore." "Eleanor," she corrected with a smile, "and I hope to see you again, David." He wasn't sure why, but something about the way she said it made him think that he actually would. David didn't expect to see Eleanor again so soon, but life had a way of surprising him. A few days after their encounter, he spotted her at the local park, while he and Emily were there for their usual afternoon walk. Eleanor sat on a wooden bench beneath a large oak tree, a book resting on her lap while she gazed out at the small pond in front of her. Emily, ever the observant one, was the first to notice. She tugged on David's hand excitedly. "Daddy, look, it's the nice lady from the store." David followed her pointing finger, and sure enough, there was Eleanor, looking just as refined and warm as before. He hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should approach, but Emily had already made up her mind. She took off running toward the elderly woman with a bright smile. Eleanor looked up just in time to see Emily rushing toward her. A delighted expression crossed her face. "Well, if it isn't my little friend," she said, setting her book aside. David caught up a few moments later, slightly out of breath. "Sorry about that," she gets excited. Eleanor chuckled. "No need to apologize. It's nice to see enthusiasm in young ones." She patted the empty space on the bench beside her. "Why don't you both sit for a while? It's a lovely day." David hesitated only for a second before nodding. He took a seat beside Eleanor while Emily perched on the grass at their feet, busy picking small flowers. "You come here often?" David asked, watching as a few ducks floated lazily across the pond. Eleanor nodded. "Almost every afternoon, it's peaceful, and it brings back memories." David glanced at her, sensing there was more to that statement. "Good memories." She smiled wistfully. "Mostly, my husband and I used to come here a lot when we were younger, and later, when our daughter was little, we'd bring her to feed the ducks." She paused, her eyes softening. She loved it here. David noted the past tense but decided not to pry. Instead, he offered a small smile. "Emily and I come here a lot too. It's her favorite place." At the mention of her name, Emily looked up from her flowers. "Because of the ducks," she said proudly. "They're funny." Eleanor chuckled. "They are indeed." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments. Then, Eleanor turned to David. "How have you been, David?" The question caught him off guard. Most people didn't bother asking, and those who did rarely wanted a real answer. But something about Eleanor's eyes told him she meant it. He debated brushing it off with a casual "I'm fine," but instead he sighed. "Trying to find work. It's been tough." Eleanor studied him for a moment before nodding. "Times are hard." David ran a hand through his hair. "Yeah, I just want to make sure Emily has what she needs. That's all that matters." Eleanor's expression softened. She's lucky to have a father who cares so much. David smiled faintly. "I'm the lucky one." Emily had gone back to her flowers, humming softly to herself. Eleanor watched her for a moment before turning back to David. "Have you tried networking? Sometimes it's not about what you know, but who you know." David let out a dry chuckle. "I wish I knew more people then." Eleanor tilted her head thoughtfully. "I might know a few." David blinked. "You might." She smiled. "I used to run a small business before I retired. I still have some connections. If you don't mind, I could ask around, see if anyone is looking for someone reliable." David hesitated, not used to accepting help, but he couldn't afford pride right now. That would be amazing, thank you." Eleanor patted his arm gently. "Don't thank me yet, let's see what happens." They spent the next half hour chatting about lighter topics: Emily's favorite books, the best places to get coffee in town, and funny stories from Eleanor's past. When the sun began to dip lower in the sky, David stood, stretching. "We should get going. Dinner time," he said. Eleanor nodded. "It was lovely seeing you both again." Emily ran up and gave Eleanor a quick hug, making the older woman laugh. "Bye, Eleanor," Emily chirped. David smiled. "Take care, Eleanor." As they walked away, David felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. Days turned into weeks, and David found himself seeing Eleanor more often. Their meetings at the park became almost routine, with Emily always excited to spot the elderly woman sitting on her usual bench. David had grown comfortable in Eleanor's presence. She had a way of making conversations easy, of listening without judgment, and of offering advice that never felt forced. One afternoon, as Emily chased a butterfly through the grass, Eleanor turned to David with a small smile. "I made a few calls." David blinked. "You did?" She nodded. "An old friend of mine, Richard Lawson, owns a small publishing business. He mentioned needing someone reliable in their logistics department. It's not glamorous, but it's steady work. I gave him your name." David exhaled, a mix of surprise and gratitude washing over him. "Eleanor, I don't know what to say, thank you." She waved a hand dismissively. "I didn't do much. He'll want to meet you first, of course, but if you're interested, I can set up the meeting." David didn't even hesitate. "Yes, absolutely." Eleanor smiled. "I'll give him a call tonight." That evening, as David tucked Emily into bed, he felt something unusual stirring in his chest. Hope. Real, tangible hope. The next few days were a whirlwind. Eleanor arranged the meeting, and David spent hours preparing. He dusted off the one good suit he owned, rehearsed answers to potential questions, and even borrowed a tie from his neighbor. When the day of the interview arrived, David stood outside the office building, taking deep breaths. He had been let down before, but something told him this time was different. Richard Lawson was a sharp-eyed man in his 60s, with a firm handshake and a no-nonsense demeanor. As they sat down in his office, he studied David carefully. "Eleanor speaks highly of you," Richard said, folding his hands on the desk. "That's not something I take lightly." David nodded. "I appreciate the opportunity, sir." Richard leaned back in his chair. "Tell me about yourself." David spoke honestly about his experience, his skills, and his need for stability. He didn't embellish, didn't try to be anything he wasn't. He just told the truth. By the end of the meeting, Richard stood and extended his hand. "I like honesty, and I like reliability. Eleanor has never led me wrong before. I'll be in touch soon." David left the office feeling cautiously optimistic. 2 days later, he got the call. He had the job. When he told Eleanor the news at the park, she simply smiled. "I knew you would." David could barely contain his gratitude. "Eleanor, I don't know how to repay you." She patted his hand. "You don't owe me anything, David. Just do your best." With a steady job, life started to stabilize. The bills became manageable, rent was no longer a looming threat, and for the first time in a long time, David felt like he was standing on solid ground. Through it all, he continued his friendship with Eleanor. They still met in the park, still talked about everything and nothing. She became like family, and Emily adored her. But as the months passed, David started to notice small changes. Eleanor seemed more tired, more frail. She moved slower, her hands shaking slightly when she reached for her tea. One evening, as they sat on the bench watching the sun dip below the horizon, Eleanor let out a weary sigh. "Life moves so quickly, doesn't it?" David looked at her, concern creeping into his voice. "Eleanor, are you feeling all right?" She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just a little tired, dear, nothing to fuss over." But David knew better. He had come to care for Eleanor like family, and the thought of something being wrong gnawed at him. Still, she never complained, never burdened him with worries. She simply continued to be Eleanor kind, wise, and quietly strong. That was until one evening when she didn't show up at the park. David waited, watching the bench where she always sat, but she never came. A sense of unease settled in his chest. Eleanor was nothing if not consistent. He decided to check on her. He knew where she lived, a modest but elegant house on the quieter side of town. When he arrived, he knocked on the door, waiting anxiously. A moment later, the door opened, and a woman in her 40s stood there. She had Eleanor's sharp blue eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked politely. David cleared his throat. "I'm David Reynolds. I'm a friend of Eleanor's. She usually meets me and my daughter at the park, but she wasn't there today. I just wanted to make sure she's all right." The woman's expression softened. "You must be the David she talks about." David blinked. "She talks about me." She nodded. "I'm Margaret, Eleanor's daughter." She glanced behind her before stepping outside and closing the door. "My mother hasn't been feeling well lately. She didn't want to worry you." David's stomach twisted. "Is it serious?" Margaret exhaled. "She's been having heart issues for a while now. The doctors say it's manageable, but she's been more tired than usual." David ran a hand through his hair. "I had a feeling something was wrong." Margaret gave him a small smile. "She's stubborn, doesn't like people fussing over her." David chuckled softly. "Sounds like her." Margaret hesitated before saying, "She cares about you and Emily a lot. You've been a bright spot in her days." David swallowed the lump in his throat. She's been the same for us. Margaret studied him for a moment before nodding. Would you like to see her? David didn't hesitate. Yes. Margaret led him inside, where Eleanor sat in a cozy armchair, a blanket draped over her lap. When she saw David, her face lit up. Well, if it isn't my favorite visitor, she said, her voice warm but tired. David moved to her side. You had me worried, Eleanor. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. I'm still here, dear. David sat beside her, determined to be there for her as she had been for him. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: Eleanor had changed his life in ways he never could have imagined. David visited Eleanor regularly after that day. Every evening, after finishing work, he'd stop by her house with Emily, bringing small treats or simply keeping her company. Eleanor, despite her declining health, never lost her warmth or humor. She loved to hear about David's new job, about Emily's adventures at school, and about the little moments that made up their lives. Margaret was often present, too, keeping a close eye on her mother. She had been cautious of David at first, but over time, she saw how much he genuinely cared. It wasn't an obligation for him, it was friendship. One afternoon, as David sat beside Eleanor in her living room, she reached for his hand. David, I need to ask you something important, she said, her voice softer than usual. He frowned slightly. Of course, what is it? She glanced toward Margaret, who gave a small nod before stepping out of the room to give them privacy. Eleanor turned back to David. I don't have much time left, dear. David immediately shook his head. Eleanor, don't. She squeezed his hand gently. Let me finish. She took a slow breath before continuing. I've been thinking a lot about what matters, about the people who have been there for me when I needed them most. And that's you, David. He swallowed hard. Eleanor, you don't have to say that. She smiled, her blue eyes shining. But I do. You and Emily have brought so much joy into my life, and I want to do something for you in return. David frowned, but before he could protest, she continued. I've made arrangements in my will. I want you to have my house. David froze. Eleanor, I can't. Yes, you can. Her grip on his hand tightened. You and Emily need stability. A home that's yours, free and clear. I have no doubt Margaret will be fine. She has her own home, her own life. But this house, this place that holds so many memories, I want it to go to someone who truly needs it. David's eyes burned as he shook his head. I don't know what to say. Say you'll accept it, she said softly. Say you'll let me do this for you, because you've already done so much for me. David felt overwhelmed, his heart pounding. He had struggled for so long, trying to find a way to provide a better life for Emily. And now, Eleanor was offering him something he never thought possible, a home of their own. Finally, he nodded, his voice thick with emotion. I'll take care of it, Eleanor. I'll take care of your home. She smiled, looking relieved. That's all I wanted to hear. Margaret re-entered the room, her expression unreadable. David braced himself, expecting her to be upset, but instead, she simply said, She's been planning this for a while, and I agree with her decision. David exhaled, feeling the weight of it all. He had never expected his simple act of kindness, helping Eleanor with her groceries that day, to lead to something like this. But Eleanor wasn't just another person he had helped. She had become family. And now he had a home, not just for Emily, but for the memories of the woman who had changed his life forever. In the weeks that followed, David found himself visiting Eleanor even more often, cherishing every conversation, every story she shared. Margaret was always nearby, taking care of her mother in ways that were both gentle and firm. David admired her strength, even as he saw the quiet sadness in her eyes. She knew, just as he did, that time was slipping away. Eleanor's health continued to decline, though she remained as sharp-witted as ever. Some days, she was too tired to come to the park, so David and Emily brought the park to her. They sat in her sunlit living room, Emily drawing pictures of ducks and flowers while David shared updates about work. Eleanor listened with a small, content smile, as if she were soaking in every detail. One crisp autumn morning, David received a call from Margaret. He knew from the tone of her voice what she was going to say before she even spoke the words. Eleanor had passed away in her sleep, peacefully, quietly, just as she had lived. David sat in silence after the call, staring out the window as Emily played on the floor with her stuffed animals. He wasn't sure how to tell her. He wasn't sure how to process it himself. Eleanor had become such a constant in their lives that the thought of a world without her felt strange, incomplete. When he finally found the words, Emily was quiet for a long time. Then, in the way only a child could, she asked, "She's with the stars now, right?" David swallowed hard and nodded. "Yeah, sweetheart, she is." The funeral was small and intimate, attended by close friends and family. David sat with Margaret, who leaned against him briefly as they listened to the eulogies. When it was his turn to speak, he stood at the podium, clearing his throat. "I met Eleanor by accident," he began, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "She dropped her oranges in a grocery store parking lot. I picked them up. It was such a small moment, but looking back, I realize it was one of the most important moments of my life." He glanced at Margaret, who offered him a small, knowing smile. "She became my friend, my daughter's friend. She was kind, wise, and had a way of making you feel like you mattered. She helped me when I needed it most, without expecting anything in return. And for that, I will always be grateful." He paused, taking a steadying breath. "She once told me that life moves quickly, that we have to cherish the moments that matter. I didn't understand how true that was until now." David looked out at the small gathering, then down at the simple wooden casket adorned with white lilies. "Thank you, Eleanor," he said softly, "for everything." After the service, Margaret pulled him aside. "She left something for you," she said, handing him a sealed envelope with his name on it. David opened it later that night, sitting on the couch with Emily curled up beside him. Inside was a handwritten letter. "David, if you're reading this, it means my time has come. I hope you won't be too sad for too long. I've lived a full life, and meeting you and Emily was one of the greatest joys of my later years. I meant what I said about the house. It's yours now, a home for you and your daughter, a place where laughter and love can continue to grow. I know you'll take good care of it. And David, don't stop believing in kindness. The world needs more of it. You've already proven that one small act can change everything. Take care of Emily, take care of yourself, and whenever you see the ducks at the park, think of me. With love, Eleanor." David pressed the letter to his chest, closing his eyes. The house became theirs officially within a few months, and moving in felt like stepping into a new chapter. Margaret helped him organize everything, ensuring that Eleanor's memory was preserved in the best way possible. Life didn't suddenly become perfect. There were still bills to pay, challenges to face. But for the first time in a long time, David felt like he had a foundation, a home that was truly his, a place where Emily could grow up without fear of having to move again. And every once in a while, when they visited the park, Emily would run to the pond, waving at the ducks with a bright smile. "Hi, Eleanor," she would call, as if the wind could carry her voice to the stars. David would smile, looking up at the sky, and whisper, "Thank you." Because in the end, Eleanor had given him more than just a house. She had given him hope, and that was something he would carry with him forever.